Well, I'm going to speak on the plight of Rohingya refugees from Myanmar and the policies of the government of Bangladesh and the outcomes of these. Okay, the objectives of the talk are to introduce the Rohingya refugees, which I don't think is necessary any longer, factors behind their marginalization and expulsion, changing policies of the government of Bangladesh, and the situation and responses of the Rohingyas to these conditions, and some conclusions. I don't think I need to say much about the Rohingyas. That has been already done. This is the area we are talking about, and you can see that this is Bangladesh, this is Arakan, and this is what is North Arakan or North Rakhine state. This is where the Rohingyas are from. And the borders of the two countries obviously are very closely linked to this situation. Now, in historical terms, these, I think my colleagues have already told you, the sequence of events which led to the stripping of the citizenship of the Rohingyas and making them effectively stateless and rightless in their own land. It goes back to Operation Nagamin in 1977-78, which attempted to separate the Rohingyas as illegal immigrants from the groups that were considered as bona fide citizens. This led to 250,000 Rohingyas being expelled to Bangladesh. Just going back to, this is a closer map of this, and you can see the green is the North Rakhine state, and the slightly reddish-brown colored area is the area of maximum concentration of the Rohingyas in Bangladesh. Now, this was followed in 1991-92 by Operation P-Thaya, otherwise Clean and Beautiful Nation. Again, I won't go into the details, but there was violence, persecution, religious and communal conflicts, which led to expulsion of another 200 to 250,000 Rohingyas. Now, this process has been continuing. There have been significant expulsions in 96, 97, 2001, 2009. In 2012, Rohingya boat people were turned back without being allowed to stay in Bangladesh. The 214 census has already been mentioned, and basically a process of ethnic cleansing has been taking place. This is just a view of the sea channel between Bangladesh and Rohingyas. This is a shot of the kind of boats which are used for people to fly from Burma to Bangladesh. Now, the government had basically three options to follow in relation to immigrants, if one terms the Rohingyas immigrants. They could either assimilate them, or they could repatriate them, or they could send them to third countries or resettlement. The government of Bangladesh followed option 2. It was large-scale forced repatriation of Rohingyas, which began from the late 1970s. After that, during 1992-93, forced repatriation used violence, threats and penalties by camp officials and police. Resistance by refugees resulted in clashes and arrests by the police, involving at least 15 deaths and injury among even more. Government and UNHCR continued large-scale forced repatriation of refugees during late 1996, even though many of those who were forced back were coming back to Bangladesh. As that happened, more were being forcibly repatriated by the government of Bangladesh with the complicity of the UNHCR. In 1997, the aggressive tactics of repatriation peaked one night when 350 refugees were rounded up at gunpoint and deported to Myanmar. Angry refugees took over an official camp and went on strike for 14 months, refusing services. Security forces could only regain control of the camp 14 months later. During this period of resistance by refugees, repatriation remained suspended. That's the important point. So resistance seemed to have curbed that process. But since then, despite resumption, repatriation has continued, but it then began decline because not because of any willingness on the part of the government of Bangladesh or UNHCR, but because the Burmese government put various bureaucratic impediments. So in a sense, the repatriation process has been sort of effectively closed down. A trickle remains. Now the third option for migrants, that of resettlement, a program for this began in 2006. However, it was stopped by the Bangladesh government in 2010 because it felt that the program encouraged more refugees. However, desperate Rohingya refugees, as has been already mentioned, undertook irregular migration to countries in the Southeast Asia, Australasia, and the Middle East. So basically, you have resettlement as it is officially defined, but even though that was stopped, it could not stop clandestine processes of resettlement going on by irregular migration involving both people and other groups operating through legal and illegal routes. In addition, if we look at the role of the government of Bangladesh, Rohingya refugees in their desperate effort to find a foothold in Bangladesh got themselves enrolled in voter list, which was obviously illegal. However, this was tolerated by the state and the local power structure, but in 2009-10, there was a large-scale crackdown by security forces which led to many Rohingyas being taken out of the electoral roll, but this was then followed by large-scale crackdown and hunting down of Rohingyas as illegal immigrants and subsequent deportation. Political changes in the Bangladesh government, the coming of a military regime and so on, made policies towards Rohingya refugees increasingly strident at this period. However, there may be a change in national policy now, but this has not come about. Now, what have been the consequences of these policies of the Bangladesh government? The government has discouraged most programs which could have improved the economic and living conditions of Rohingyas in Bangladesh, the Rohingya refugees. The argument has been that this would provide incentives to more refugee influx. Perverse as it is, that is a standard argument. The government has formally closed down two major options for resolving this protracted refugee situation: integration with the local community and resettlement in other countries. The option of repatriation, as I pointed out earlier, has been made increasingly difficult, not because of the government of the UNHCR, but because the Myanmar government itself has become more obstructive. Now, this is the scenario which are faced by the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. What has been their response? And I think some of these responses are very interesting and they lead to very unintended kind of consequences. First of all, the Rohingyas are divided into registered refugees and unregistered refugees. The registered refugees are a very small fraction, about 30,000. They receive international assistance, free food rations, and so on. But nonetheless, they also undertake some covert economic activities, but they become largely dependent on external assistance, including food aid, which means they are a very quiet and compliant group on the whole, unless they are activated by incidents like the one that I mentioned earlier. Now, the unregistered refugees are 93% of the Rohingya refugees. Very few live in unofficial campsites. Most are dispersed among the local population, the local Bangladeshi population. They are denied access to assistance, asylum, and protection. They are not recognized as refugees. They do not receive any international assistance, including food rations. Only a small number live in two makeshift campsites. Most of, I've already said that. Just short of Rohingya family living amongst the people, amongst the ordinary people, not in refugee camps. Now, constraints faced by all Rohingya refugees, registered or unregistered. They are subject to continuous threats of arbitrary arrest, physical assault, robbery, eviction from shelters, deportation to Myanmar, as well as extortion of cash, goods, and services. This happens typically when working refugees who have been working in other parts of the country have some earnings and they're coming back home to wherever their families are. They're stopped on the way by various officials who extort the money that they have, their wages, which they're bringing back, on pain of detaining them. Refugee women and girls going out for wage work, market transactions, or collecting firewood in forested areas, even those staying at home in the camps or in the villages, are susceptible to sexual harassment and rape. The perpetrators include officials, local villagers, or even fellow Rohingya refugees in some cases. This is a shot of one of the unofficial campsites, and you can see a kind of, how slum-like the living conditions are. Now, despite the attempts by the Rohingyas to try and survive, they have been subject to discrimination and hostility in various forms. There is this popular perception that refugees are taking away jobs from local people while receiving superior services, for example, in terms of medical treatment from international NGOs. So there is systematic anti-immigrant media reports about Rohingyas publicized by the xenophobic local press in Cox's Bazar. Opposition from local workers who are undercut by Rohingyas in the labor market. This is because Rohingyas will accept lower wages and tougher job conditions compared to locals. And in a sense, they're taking away, to some extent, the jobs of the locals. This has created a backlash. Restrictions on Rohingyas have appeared in some places if they are garments workers or rickshaw pullers, etc. In some cases, Rohingya children are now excluded from government educational schools, which they had attended so far, but because of this increasing anti-immigrant feelings, there are restrictions coming in. Secondly, as I've mentioned, Rohingyas had enrolled in the electoral register, and this was facilitated by local politicians who thus obtained local loyal vote banks. But the deregistration of 100,000 Rohingyas in 2007-8 meant they lost their possibility of getting citizenship through that kind of documentation, but it also delinked them from the patronage of powerful local politicians because they no longer had the benefit of the vote. This exacerbated the vulnerability of the Rohingyas. Thirdly, adverse consequences of pressure on Rohingya refugees this is true, has created pressure on the local ecological resources. Forests have been cut down, wetlands have been contaminated. So there is this popular perception that Rohingyas are too much of a pressure for the local population. It should also be said that the local Bangladeshis in Cox's Bazar district are also very poor. In some cases, their conditions are not much better than that of the refugees. So there is some degree of truth in that. And there have been some instances of aggressive action against the Rohingyas. Individual landlords have evicted Rohingyas. This is symptomatic of the rupture of clientelist relations. So in concluding remarks on the Rohingyas, first of all, despite they had to survive in a condition where they had little choice but to break the rules that were imposed on them. What the Bangladesh government said is that you cannot go out to work, you cannot work, and you don't have food. But the government did not solve that problem. It just said you can't work. So under those conditions, Rohingyas had to break the rule. They had to undertake illegal activities like pursuing food options. And in order to do that, they had to become clients of powerful figures, powerful employers who gave them protection against the state and its security forces. But it also exposed them to various kinds of extortions. So one must say that they've coped with adversity in innovative ways. The unregistered refugees living among the local population have integrated themselves. They have access to better and more diverse food compared to those receiving international food assistance, which is kind of packaged food. They have also developed informal clientelist relationships with local power holders, giving them significant degrees of local protection. They've made use of kinship and clientelist ties. Existing refugees have helped newcomers in a process of chain migration. There is a kind of community formation as well. Despite all the pressure, despite being clandestine, Confronted with the difficulties facing them, some of the Rohingyas have undertaken international migration to other countries through clandestine means as boat people. Again, one must see this as options, responses in desperate conditions. In limiting contexts, people without choice must do what they have to do. The option of resettlement has been partly realized through such covert and clandestine means, bypassing the official impasse. So what this demonstrates is the agency of the Rohingya refugees. Despite their extremely disadvantageous position, the Rohingyas have demonstrated their agency in coping against the odds. They've deployed their own weapons of the weak, if one can say that, to find niches of survival within the existing power structure, despite formal restrictions. Now, the government of Bangladesh has had a very difficult position, and there is certainly a certain ambivalence. First of all, the government of Bangladesh has no power on stopping what happens in Myanmar. So the government of Bangladesh has really been reacting to events which are forced on them by the government and the Rakhine mobs in the Arakan. The government is also aware that there is a demand for Rohingya labor and services amongst powerful interest groups consisting of Bangladeshi employers and patrons. And this is no different from what happens with irregular migrants in Europe or the United States. Local employers are their patrons. Now, despite anti-Rohingya rhetoric for home consumption by the Bangladesh government, one should also say that the government has allowed most of the refugees to stay on, despite its speeches and its rhetoric. This is indicative of a certain ambivalence in the attitude of the government, which has provided a space for Rohingya refugees to survive despite a web of formal restrictions. The role of international aid and donor agencies is also interesting. There is no doubt that international aid and donor agencies have expressed sympathy and support for the refugees. They've done very little to stop the root cause of the Rohingya exodus in terms of restraining the carnage by the Myanmar government through the imposition of pressure or sanctions. While the UNHCR has looked after Rohingya refugees and their interests up to a point, it has also been allegedly complicit in their forced repatriation to Myanmar, as noted by local observers and indeed international NGOs. Thank you.